through and understand news, understand how all of these things happen. I am such a big fan of yours. You're probably one of the only people I've actually read like as regularly. I think you were my news Bible, analyzer of Bible of news, whatever, because the news was always, I'm an immigrant from Pakistan, and learning what's going on in America, and what we were told in Pakistan was so different than what we actually experienced over here. And you kind of deciphered news for me. And I just totally 100% believed what you did, what you would write. And it just felt so, you made it look, that it made sense. You put together news for us, you super hyper analyzed it, and been very like short little packages. And it was like almost would save you so much time in analyzing. So tell me about this thing. So I wanted to just, I know you have like an illustrious career. And then when I finally met you, I also realized, I was told that, wow, you're not just the god of news, but also your father was also in his time, like
yes,
the
he
real
was.
god of news.
Yes, my father was the editor of the New York Times for an incredibly long time. He was actually the editor-in-chief. He was the executive editor, and he was a correspondent in New Delhi, and that's where I was born. Wow. At Sita Sen's nursing home in New Delhi in 1956, and I traveled with him. Obviously, my family did until I was around 7.5. We moved to the United States, and he became an editor at the Times and eventually took over the paper and was one of the most important, journalists of his generation. Maybe in terms of newspaper journalists, he may have been the most important. In the mid 1970s, the New York Times was on the verge of bankruptcy, like many, many, many other newspapers were. And he and the publisher and the president of the company embarked on a very risky pursuit of investment. And they created the multiple section newspaper, what you see today, where you have the main section, then you have sports, and then you have Metro, and then you have this. That didn't exist before. And they decided to do that. Everyone thought they were crazy, and they did it partly for journalistic reasons and also partly for financial reasons. And the very first ones they created were Sports Monday and the Living section. And each time they would trade off. The newsroom would get the sports section and a science section. The advertising department would get the travel section and the living section, But they always insisted that they do it in a New York Times way. And so they created a whole kind of cultural and social journalism that hadn't really existed before. And it turned newspapers around. There used to be like 8 morning newspapers in New York.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? I know. And they went out of business one after another starting in the 70s for a variety of reasons. So he was a really big deal. He was also kind of a jerk, but he was a really big deal.
Of course. So how did this become such a big powerhouse? I fail to understand. And I think, is it because you guys were just better in sifting news and figuring out what's fake, what's not, and what? Or is it just alliances that you guys make? Like, how do you? I'm not a journalist. I'm a doctor. You made time very efficient for me. So I read New York Times because of the news, and then
that's what people read it for.
When you stopped working, I stopped reading news.
The New York Times was the first, maybe, or certainly one of the first nonpartisan newspapers in the United States. It was originally founded by a guy named Henry Raymond, who was a founding member of the Republican Party. It was Abraham Lincoln's campaign manager. But remember, the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln is the Democratic Party of today. and the Democratic Party of that period is the Republican Party of today. They switched places around the turn of the century. And but he sold it to a man named Adolph Oakes, who was from Tennessee, I believe. And he was in the newspaper business, and he founded the first nonpartisan newspaper. He's the, you know, without fear or favor was his mantra. And it took a long time, but, you know, over the decades and then over, you know, 150 years, the New York Times developed a reputation for providing extremely high quality, well-written, reliable, and nonpartisan news. And I mean,
That's
it's a
how
much
it
more,
branded itself.
yeah, yeah.
Like that's
All
a
the
branding thing. Or you were like also like part of branding is like that.
all the news that's fit to print was the motto. They always consider themselves a family newspaper. And he said his purpose was to improve society by informing people, and that they would do that without regard to the special interests or the parties involved. That the New York Times would do this, as he said, without fear or favor, and that they would take a position where they were agnostic. You know, they were indifferent about the outcome of the story, even if the story turned out badly for our side, whatever that is. That didn't matter, and that held, you know, and it also was held up by a family that was willing to invest, that really believed in it, and that believed in the idea of quality journalism serving an audience. And it never went for a really big audience. It always was going for sort of a high quality audience. By the 1970s, the New York Times was in trouble like every other newspaper, but it maintained this reputation as being the best American newspaper. And that's partly because it went outside its zone. It wasn't just a New York newspaper. In fact, the New York coverage often suffered because we were spending so much money on the national coverage and the international coverage and the cultural coverage and all the rest of it. It was, you know, and the power of the New York Times in New York at one time was quite extraordinary. The New York Times Broadway critic could shut down a show like that overnight if he didn't like it, and did. My oldest friend in the world, he's still my best friend. We met when we were 11. His father was a composer, and he and another guy opened a show on Broadway. My mother and I went to the opening, and it closed the next day because it was terrible. And the New York Times critics said it was awful, you know. And the thing is that it was also partly because of scarcity. There were not a lot of sources of reliable information for a long period of time. Now, the internet, television changed that. And the internet has changed that enormously. Television changed it, but television went cheap, you know, and the newspapers stayed high quality. The internet has changed everything.
When you say television went cheap, what do you mean? Like, did they too much?
They went for short, easy to digest news, you know, because time was of the essence to them. And time was literally money on television. And remember, television makes all of its money from advertisers in that period. Now you have subscribers, but in that period of time, the only source of revenue for television was advertising, which meant you had to have a minimum of 10 hours of advertising every half an hour. It meant you had, and very often it meant you had to cater to the advertisers. And sometimes that would affect their news coverage. The New York Times always had two major sources of income. The internet challenged all of this, but we had two pillars. We had the advertising and we had the subscriptions. And our subscriptions were always a hell of a lot more expensive than everybody else's. They still are. Their prescriptions are more expensive now. But people were willing to pay, and the advertising rates in the New York Times are also very high. And the idea was that the subscribers protected us from the advertisers. In other words, we weren't solely relying on the advertisers for our income, so that could keep us to withstand pressure from them should they choose to apply it. And the advertisers protected us from the subscribers. In other words, we didn't have to go for blood and gore and stupid, you know, gossip, because we had these advertisers who would keep us going and sustain us through periods. And it always worked out until the internet came along. And then the whole formula went into the garbage can overnight. And now the New York Times relies more heavily on subscribers than it does on advertisers. It still has both, but it used to be that 75% of the income came from advertisers and 25% came from subscribers. Now it's the other way around. It's like 60-40. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's mostly the subscribers now.
Yeah, yeah. And
And
what's the monthly subscription of New York Times? I can't charge more than
I,
my product.
I have no idea what it is, to be honest with you. I bought my New York Times subscription so long ago, and I've completely forgotten. And the interesting thing is, the New York Times is constantly raising the rates, and people don't cancel.
Yeah,
No, they do. They
I
cancel.
haven't
They cancel. They cancel here and they cancel there. And the New York Times had a problem. Its demographics were old and dying and elitist and extremely white, and it's had to deal with that. They
but it
still
was the
are.
Republican Party owned initially, and
Before
then it turned into a,
before the family that owns it now bought it. Yeah, it was like all newspapers in America. It was affiliated with a political party. They all were,
oh, wow.
and that's
Then
true in most
it got
countries too. By the
political.
way, that's true in most countries. Like in Sweden, where I had some experience, most of the newspapers, virtually all of them, are affiliated with a political party,
Nice.
and it affects their news coverage as well as their opinions.
So then they basically hire people who kind of are in line with a certain party.
Well, basically, or you don't go to work for them unless you are like that. I mean, the Wall Street Journal is an interesting example of this because the Wall Street Journal's editorial page is entirely right wing. They don't run op-eds by anybody who's not right wing, and it can get pretty extreme. However, their newsroom is completely independent and is filled with liberal Democrats.
Oh,
Because news journalism is inherently a liberal small L pursuit, right? It is.
freedom.
I mean, in the sense that you believe in openness and free speech and transparency, and those are inherently liberal things. In the United States, it's inherently an urban occupation, and in the United States, the urban populations tend to be more liberal than the. So newspapers are often hit for being liberal. But it's a word that no longer has any meaning. I try not to use the words liberal and conservative anymore because in our politics they have no meaning. And the meanings that they're assigned have been twisted so badly out of shape and proportion.
Wow.
It's an extreme statement, but there are no true well, that's not true. You can count on one hand the number of true conservatives that are left in the Republican Party in public life. Liz Cheney.
I never really understood some of the political leanings, because sometimes most people that I tend to like are the ones who are in the center.
Mm-hmm.
They're like more balanced and not like neither this nor that, and
right.
It's like more balanced view of life. Because I come from a place which is so conservative. I mean, in Pakistan is seriously conservative.
And from a place of incredible political extremes, right? Where you have dictators, and then you have crooks, and then you have cricket players, and then you have this, and then you have that.
Basically,
I mean, this is also
dictators and crooks. That's like it's like we're between a rock and a hard place.
Well, it was a country that was set up for failure by the British government.
Yeah.
It was set up for failure.
Yeah.
I mean, first it was divided by 3,000 miles of India into two parts, which is insanity. And in a period of time when it took you 3 days to get to India from the United States, this country was like, it would be as if the United States consisted of LA and New York.
Yeah.
And everything else in between was owned by Russia. I mean, it's absurd,
Yeah.
And also, Pakistan has also suffered. By the way, is it Pakistan or Pakistan, or how do you say it? Pakistan.
I feel I'm one of those people who feel that our forefathers sold the copyrights to India, the name India. And we should have been like Korea, North Korea, South Korea. We should have been like South India or North India. However, our forefathers, my forefathers threw away the name, which was also our identity at one point, and gave us a new identity and gave us a new Islamicized identity.
an Islamicized identity because
Yeah.
the division was done along sectarian lines,
Yes.
and because England was more aligned with the what is now called India than they were with what is now called Pakistan, and we inherited a lot from India. In this country and in Europe, over time, the Hindu perspective on India was the dominant one.
Yeah.
And Hindus, in the United States, we decided that Hindu Indians were semi-white people, kind of, sort of. But Muslims, no. And in the 20th century, it got worse and worse and worse. And in the 21st century, of course, there is this incredible sort of presumption of guilt on the part of Islam, right? And Pakistan was the first Islamic country, really, when you think about it,
Like
right?
like the first Jewish country, like Israel. It's like, based on a faith, on a religion. It is.
Right, but it's also based on deciding, okay, everybody north of this line gets screwed and everybody south of this line is going to, and the number of people on both sides of the line who were left behind was extraordinary, right? The number of Hindus that were left in India, in Pakistan, the number of Muslims that were left in India. And this led to going on now 70 years of animosity, hatred, wars. How many
Yeah.
times have India and Pakistan gone to war? And now they're both nuclear countries,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the next war between India and Pakistan ends the world.
I hope not. We are like distant cousins. We do not. We may not like each other, but we're so, like my father's family was like 5 generations ago were all Hindus. My
uh-huh.
mother's family is more from Iran. They moved out of, there she has Persian traits. So one,
Right, but if you're allowed to understand each other, you can.
yeah,
But
we
then you
speak.
get a
I
guy.
went to New
But
Delhi
does
and
Modi,
spoke the language.
does the prime minister of India have the slightest interest in Hindus and Muslims getting to know each other better?
No, I don't think
No,
so.
he doesn't, because
You
his
divide
power
and
comes
rule.
out of fear and division, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't
If
want to.
you,
I don't want to vilify him. I'm just saying that in the modern world, politics is entirely about division.
yeah.
Because politics, especially in the United States, is $1 trillion a year industry, and there's no money to be made in agreement. If everybody agrees with each other,
Politics and games are the religion of this era, in
that's true.
opinion.
Except the
Like
game,
politics, and
game,
so
game.
what politics you are and what games you like, those
Well,
are
these
the
games
small
are
clubs we
fun.
make. But
Anyway,
Pakistan, the name Pakistan means the land of pure. So it feels like, these are the people who were like
yeah.
holier now, kind of whatever, and they're like, okay, we are pure. And initially, our founder was basically a very broad-minded. Jinnah was like a very
Mm-hmm.
British educated and a lawyer and very wealthy, and he wanted actually rights for everyone, and he thought that Muslims will get vilified in India. That's why they should have like a place of their own where they are not like, it's like if someday all the blacks want just one country for their own self.
Right, right.
And so that's like, so he thought that, we were like the people who were the lower castes. They, instead of becoming Christians, they, staying Hindus, they became Christians or Muslims or stuff. They converted. And, some of the lower castes. So this was their way out to find another
Right.
way of like a place. And then they just called themselves something else. So this became like, Pakistan came into being because the very large number of people just said that, oh, we should have like just our own space.
We should
And
have our own
it's not
space
good.
because this other space is not friendly to us, too. That was part of the
Yes.
problem. And but let's not forget that, look, there were these kinds of rivalries and wars on the subcontinent going back to when Europeans were still wearing fur jockstraps. It's one of the oldest civilizations on Earth.
Yeah.
And but the British came in there
Yeah.
and they turned it into an insane asylum. And for them, pitting the Muslims and the Hindus against each other was a very useful thing.
Yeah.
And then they draw these borders that mean, look at all, every border ever drawn by England is now an international disaster. Even their own border. It's absolutely amazing. They came and agreed with Scotland. You
Exactly.
know, and I'm not excusing the United States here. Don't get me wrong. I can go on and
There's
on
a
and on.
lot of gerrymandering in United States. I'm just learning what gerrymandering is here
It's
for
actually pronounced Gary. It's actually pronounced
gerrymandering.
Gary.
Yes.
Yeah, the only politician who ever pronounced it correctly was Ronald Reagan.
Ah, nice.
And people made fun of him, but he was right because the guy who invented it, his name was Gary. So
Nice.
Gary Mandrake.
So it should
Anyway,
be.
yeah,
No, I'm
our
still
political.
learning.
I mean,
So
look at
how
what's
did you
happening.
become
Look what's
Jerry?
happening right now. The entire future United States is down to about two congressional districts. And it's just shocking. It's the worst. People used to say that American democracy is the worst system except for all the others. It's just simply not true. And the more this goes on, the more I realize that our system is fundamentally broken because it was created to establish an unbreakable divide between the rural parts of the country and the urban parts of the country. And there is no even distribution of power in this country. If you live in Wyoming, you have more say in the government than if you live in California.
Wow.
It's just absurd. But the only way to change it is by a constitutional amendment. Good luck with that.
Well, I would love to learn a little more because politics is just inherently.
You're married to one of the smartest political minds I know.
I know he's super amazing, but I tell him that I basically unless it's in New York Times, do I want to read?
There's good
Well, I am
places to read. What's a really pretty good publication is Mother Jones. It's very liberal slanted, but they
Yeah,
do
I do.
extremely good journalism. Mother
So,
Jones.
what do you think about social media now? I mean, is it changing the
Well,
demographic of news? Because
it,
where are we now with news?
Jeez, that's a big question. Social media changed everything, clearly, partly because the news industry's response to it was one of ignorance, stupidity, and lack of skill. And we listened to a lot of people in the beginning who told us the truth about the internet, and they were all completely wrong about every single thing they said.
We have some of your slides and stuff. I have, some of the things, that we tried to create. Like I wanted to come up with some of the questions that I wanted to ask you is like,
you want to talk about these?
Yes, I want to talk about,
So
because
this
one of the questions was that like the top 5 articles that
right.
you like of all the things that you talked about. And I was like, what are these things? Why do they impact you the way they do? And what brought you to all these? Why did you choose these out of all your babies? Out of
Well,
the thousands of babies we wrote.
I thought about it very carefully. The first one I listed was my first byline in the New York Times, which was in 1987, and I wrote an article. Yeah, the Queen Elizabeth II.
Yeah,
nope,
yeah. No,
not that one.
There.
That's it. Problems tarnished QE2's arrival in New York.
Okay.
So this was the first
1987. How old were you?
I was 31.
Oh, wow.
And I just turned 31 in February of that year. And this was the first story I had on the front page. It was an extremely unread story because if you up at the upper right of the page is an article about Senator Gary Hart's presidential campaign collapsing. But it was on the front page because they sent me down to write an article about the Queen Elizabeth II returning to New York in its first transatlantic voyage since it had been outfitted at the cost of tens of millions of dollars. And people who aren't in journalism don't know this, but there's a thing called shipping news, and because New York Times and other newspapers in port cities used to give details on every ship that docked and left the ship because it was big news. The city was big news. And being sent to shipping news was a real insult. So my editor asked me to go cover this story, and I said, "Oh my God, you're sending me to shipping news. What did I do wrong?" And he laughed and he said, "No, it'll be kind of a funny story. Just go for humor." So I went down there, and it turned out that the thing was a disaster. One of the propellers had fallen off in the middle of the Atlantic. The first class cabins flooded, and they moved all the first class passengers into the second class cabins. The air conditioning broke down. They had to refund some millions of dollars worth of tickets. Nobody showed up for the homecoming. There were supposed to be fireboats and airplanes flying over by, and the mayor. And the only people that showed up was the high school marching band from Passaic, New Jersey. I was standing there playing Soul Man rather pathetically while all these people got off the boat. And it happened that I had a friend, the father of a friend, who was in the cruise business, and he was there. And I said to him, "F, what's going on?" He goes, "Oh my God, it's a disaster." And he took me on the ship and he took me to all these places and let me see what's going wrong. And so the story went on the front page. I wrote it for, and all that.
Nice.
My first byline.
That's the
The
first.
next
Okay.
the next day, my dad calls me and he said, "I'm looking at your byline." And I said, "Yeah, it's exciting, isn't it?" And he said, "Yeah." And that wasn't my first byline, it was my first front page byline. I'm sorry, I'd gotten bylines previously.
Uh-huh.
And he said, "Look up my first byline, Andy." And I remembered that almost exactly 40 years earlier,
Uh-huh.
my father had gotten his very first byline on the front page of the New York Times. And it was his first byline. It was on the front page, and it was about a passenger ship that had been one of these ships that was commissioned by the military to carry troops during World War II. And it had just come back into service as a passenger ship and was arriving in New York Harbor for the first time. And there was a big celebration.
Wow. Oh my
So we
God.
basically wrote the same exact story, and it appeared in the same exact place on the same exact newspaper.
Oh
It's
my,
insane, right? And
amazing.
yeah, and so that was my first byline in a major American newspaper, was actually in the Washington Post, of all places, when I was in Moscow, and Konstantin Chernenko, who was the Soviet leader, died, and Mikhail Gorbachev took over. And for some reason that I've never understood, the Washington Post correspondent in Moscow forgot to write a story about it. So for the first edition, Ben Bradley, who was the legendary editor of the Washington Post, ran my story in the lead position with a byline from Moscow. And
Nice.
he had it framed, mounted and framed, sent to my father with a note that said, "I thought you'd like to see Andy's first byline in a real newspaper."
Nice.
Because it
Nice.
was, of course,
That's like, so that's you're 31 at that
I
moment.
was 31 years old. Yeah.
Nice, nice.
If
31
you
years
go
young,
to,
31 years
yeah,
young, I would say.
you go back a
Uh,
slide.
so what is the second one? So what is this thing you're for the quest for transgender equality? I see that you've done work and you also may helped make some laws with this particular thing. I wanted to ask, my question is like, why did this issue speak out to you more?
Um, like a
Why
lot
did
of things in journalism, it's like a question of serendipity. I had an editorial writer that I had hired, who was extremely good, named Ernesto Londoño. He was born in Bogota. English was his second language, but he wrote English better than most Americans. He was absolutely brilliant. He covered international and military stuff for us. He also happens to be gay, and he was very interested in the topic of transgender Americans, who are among the most marginalized and forgotten people. I mean, the worst person to be in America is a Black transgender woman. I mean, you're going to get screwed in 16 different directions, right? And he
yeah.
came to me with a proposal that we do this.
Oh,
And like most men of my generation, well, actually, unlike most men of my generation, I know a lot more about this than most men of my generation do. So I was open to it, but it's a bit of a tough sell. And so we talked to the members of our board, the editorial board, about 15 of them, most of whom were in their 50s and 60s. And they were all really eager to do it. Ernesto really sold them on it. So we did a series, we broke it down into parts. And one of the things we did that had never been done before was we provided a space on our website where people could upload videos or essays about their own experience in being transgender or knowing people who are transgender. And everybody told us we were insane to do that it would be awful, blah, 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 blah. But we did it anyway. And one of the nice things about being editorial page editor was I could do whatever I wanted to. I only had one boss, the publisher, and he hardly ever told me no, so it was fine. And I thought we'd get 5 or 6 or 7 of these things. We got so many, we got hundreds, and we got so many that it overwhelmed our system. We had to shut down for 2 days. It was a whole big event. The last of the episodes, of the parts, was about the military, which was very far behind on this issue of transgender people serving openly in the military. Remember, it's not about whether or not they can serve. It's a question of whether they have to lie about it, right? Just like gay people, right? And so we did a big article about that. And we had a little video that we had an outside producer had done for us about a couple in the Air Force, a transgender man and a transgender woman. And they were lying about who they were, but they decided that they would reveal themselves in a video on the New York Times website on the day that this editorial about transgender rights in the military appeared. The very first thing that happened was they were both ordered to wear gender appropriate uniforms, which is kind of hilarious because the man, the transgender man who they considered to be a woman, looked like Dolph Lundgren, but on steroids. I mean, this guy, he's a gunner in Afghanistan. Wow. You know, we had pictures of him working out. He was like, and she was this little tiny, cute little Latina girl, you know. But the next day after that, we were very upset and we thought we'd ruin their lives. But the next day after that, got a call from the spokesman for the Secretary of Defense. And he said, the secretary wants you to know that he read the editorial, and more important, he watched the video, and he is right now signing an order to reverse the policy, even as we speak, because of you. And that it never happened before, and it's never happened since, and it'll never happen again. But it was an amazing moment.
Wow, to change.
And I felt like we've done what we're supposed to do, which is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And that series helped transgender people, and it made straight people without an open mind incredibly uncomfortable. So it achieved 2 wonderful objectives, I think. Nice. It challenged the oppressors and it helped the oppressed. And interestingly, you know, during that period of time, whenever I was in a boring meeting, which was pretty regularly, and I wanted it to end soon, virtually everybody in those meetings was a man, right? So and they were mostly older and you know, kind of straight-laced. And so whenever I wanted the meeting to be over, I'd bring up the transgender series and those guys to be out of there. Like you could hear the sonic boom being created by their. That was that one.
Exit strategy in meetings.
There's an exit strategy in meetings for a while. So that really meant a tremendous amount to me. You know, you asked me to take 40 years of writing and tell you which of my favorite 5 pieces.
Yeah, which one is your favorite child?
Exactly.
If you had like so many. I also wanted to ask you another important question is like, as you know, as the former god of news, are you a believer?
Am I what?
A believer.
In news?
A believer.
I am a
believer in whatever. Believer in news? Yes, you are. But
do you want to know? Where did you get that picture of Killian?
You know, we have been like looking and finding, you know, these are your top 5, you know, I said top 10 females, but we were able to find pictures of 5. So I was going to make it part 1 and part 2. I'll give you more time just so you don't get in trouble if you have other people.
About these 5?
These are top 5 females. Then I have also another one of top 5 males, but I will go through your why you picked these. And I also want to know, like, if you're a believer. That was one like quick question, like just a yes and no answer.
Yes, I am a believer in journalism. I'm a believer in news. I think the journalism business and the news business is under threat. I think it's suffered enormously because of a lot of bad decisions that we've collectively made in the face of challenges from the internet and in the face of a kind of politics that none of us were ever prepared for. And it took us way too long, and they're still working on how to respond to it. The American news media continue to operate as if there are two political parties that are equally dedicated to the proposition of governing this country. That's just simply not true. And that leaves them in a really bad place, right? Their response to Donald Trump was terrible. People are going to love these. So each of these books has a specific meaning to me. I'm not saying they're the best books ever written, although Catch-22 is definitely at the top of that. But they are books that had an impact on me at different times in my life. Most recently, the bottom two.
Really?
Devil in a Blue? Devil in a Blue Dress. It was a book by Walter Mosley. I'm a big fan of detective books and such. And he has a character named Ezekiel Rawlins. Everybody calls him Easy Rawlins. And he lives in LA, starts in like the 1940s and 50s, and he's Black. And Walter Mosley wrote about being Black in LA in a way that other people were not doing. And he was doing, and he has I've heard him speak, and he has this incredible relationship with his characters, especially with Easy Rawlins, you know. And he opened my eyes, you know, to things I didn't understand before. You know, I remember I came here when I was almost 8 years old. And I had never seen a Black person in my life. Maybe I had, but it never registered on me, not an African American, you know. And I didn't know I didn't know anything.
But you were in India, weren't they all like different colors? We are all like so colorful in India. We have so many.
Well, I don't believe that color is really what drives this. It's actually racism that drives it. I mean, if you looked at whenever Barack Obama would go and speak at Congress when he was president, and John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, would sit behind him, John Boehner is 4 shades browner than Barack Obama because he spends his life in a tanning salon. So, I mean, skin color is meaningless, as you know, and I know, and everything else. But I didn't know about any of this stuff. And like, I learned a lot about the civil rights movement and about racism and about slavery from the singer Odetta, who is an incredible, you know, she's one of the people I would someday love to meet, to be honest with you. I mean, she taught me about racism with her songs, you know, and not to be a racist, but how to identify it, which is different, right? It's really easy to teach people how to be racist, but teach them how to identify it is a different thing.
So I, you know,
let me really quickly, Catch-22, one of the best novels ever written, right? Satire about war, just brilliant. The Once and Future King is by T.H. White. It's the story of King Arthur, but told with a sense of humor. Everybody knows the first book, which was called The Sword in the Stone, and Disney made a movie out of it. The Dragon, I'm a big science fiction fan, and the guy who got me started on science fiction was Robert Heinlein. He wrote Space Cadet and Stranger in a Strange Land. He was an idiot, a pervert, and a racist, and so I don't like to read his books anymore. But The Dragon Riders of Pern, I read very early, and it was written by a woman named Anne McCaffrey. And if anybody's ever watched Game of Thrones, the central plot of Game of Thrones about the dragons is stolen directly from that book.
Really? Which one is that?
The Dragon Riders of Pern. Yeah.
Oh, really?
And go back one more time.
One more back.
Yeah. Young Men in Fire is a memoir written by Norman MacLean, who wrote A River Runs Through It. And it's about the relationship between humans and fire, forest fires in particular, and about older men and younger men. And it's just amazing.
Okay. I have like a reading to do. I almost never read non-fiction. It's like fiction actually.
I read fiction mostly too. Somebody asked me what book I'm reading right now. It's called Warhammer 4000. It's about space marines.
So when it's news is like, you know, when reality is stranger than fiction, then what do we need fiction for? You know?
Well, we need news. We need news in this country. Somewhere around 70 or 75% of modest size American cities. Forget about the small towns and forget about the big cities. do not have a single full-time paid journalist working inside them.
Wow.
And this means that 70% of American governments are operating with complete impunity and total darkness. And if anybody believes that the government can operate in darkness and it's not going to harm them, we should have a talk. But it's a bad situation, and the news has been undermined not just by disinformation and misinformation and lying and the whole propaganda of Fox News and all the rest of that. It's also been undermined by the journalists themselves. You know, they put in way too much opinion. They talk about themselves constantly. The political coverage, I'll be honest with you, I didn't read a single story about the campaign for 3 weeks before Tuesday.
Yeah, wow.
Because I wasn't going to find out what was going to happen until Election Day. And really, that's the only answer I want. What's going to happen? And you know what's happening? Look what's happening today, right? Every headline is defying expectations. The much advertised red wave never materialized. Well, whose expectations were those, and who advertised the red wave? The very same journalists that are now writing with their surprise that it never emerged, and now they're going to go out and find reasons why it didn't happen that have nothing to do with their own incompetence.
Yeah, they couldn't see it coming, or they saw it coming and didn't.
They're too focused on data. Data before Election Day tells you very little about outcomes. It tells you about strategies and it tells you about approaches. But all of this polling that's going on, you know, and the New York Times has gone just like out of its mind with it.
Yeah.
You know, with these needles and this, and then after every election, they tell us why, if you believe the needle, you were stupid.
Yeah.
Trump was elected, and the New York Times said, "Oh, you were too stupid to understand our needle." I mean, come on, really? You know? Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm ranting.
So, have you ever done one question on health insurance? You know, as a doctor, I'm one of your biggest doctor fans. So, as a doctor, my one question is also: have you ever written about the health insurance industry, or the here or abroad, or if you have also like another thing that I wanted to ask you?
I'm happy to report that I have never written a single article about health insurance that I can remember. My wife is one of the country's leading authorities on that subject, so you should have her on.
I will.
In fact, during the Hillary Clinton healthcare business, I was the editor in Washington, but my wife was a lobbyist and she was lobbying on that subject, so I had nothing to do with it. It was the best time of my life. I didn't have to do anything to do with the healthcare coverage, and it was a disaster. The only story about food I ever wrote about in the United States was about the Coors Beer Company and how they were doing recycling before anybody else did.
That's it.
So no, I'm sorry. Abroad, sure. I mean, you know, when I was in Russia, I wrote about the crappy medical care, but that's not really what you're asking.
Yeah.
And I wrote about food shortages and such. Most of my understanding of that comes from, I learned early on as a manager that the best way of managing was to figure out the things that you really sucked at and then find people who are really good and then let them do it. Right. And science in that was, if I did not become a journalist, I would have liked very much to have been involved in the computer industry.
Oh, computers.
Yeah, I bought my first PC in 1985. I had my first email address in 1987. I love computers. When I was like 12 years old, my father took me to Florida to see an Apollo moon launch. And the very first science editor of the New York Times, actually the very first science editor of any newspaper, a guy named Hank Lieberman, incredibly nice man who smoked disgusting cigars. And I was sitting next to him on the plane. And I said to him, Hank, because I got to call them all by their first name because my daddy was the boss. And I said, Hank, how do computers work? And so on the way down to Florida, he taught me binary code.
Oh.
And then the entire time we were in Florida, he would take an hour out of the day to teach me about computers. And he created a lifelong interest in computers for me. But in my family, you didn't go into computers. You know, you went into journalism or the law. Or, you know. My brother, who retired at 47 because he was so financially successful, was considered the black sheep of the family because he became an accountant. And then a multimillionaire. So
That's not a bad thing.
I think it's a good thing. But I would love to be in journalism. I would love to be in. I would love to have different skills now and be developing apps and trying to figure out how to make the phone work for people and not for corporations. I mean, I would just love to be in that.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, so one other question I have is, if you ever met your 5-year-old self, what would you say to that child, and what do you think that child would say to you? You know, the child who was walking home from school in Japan. You know, you told me that
Yeah, yeah.
you
I walked to school when I was in first grade.
so
I didn't go to.
if you met that kid right now, what would that kid say to you, and what would
I
you
would
say?
tell him not to be so afraid.
Oh,
I would tell him not to be so afraid of things that were happening to him, and I would not tell him not to be so afraid of what other people think. And I would tell him, that he deserves happiness.
ah, that's it.
And
And what would
and if I was that 5-year-old, I would look at me like this.
that's it? You wouldn't say anything?
What's to
Were you a
say?
happy child?
Yes and no. Oh, outwardly, I was a very happy child. Everybody thought I was very carefree and very happy. But I had a lot of nervous tics and I had bags under my eyes, and I was actually a very scared and fearful child.
Oh, well, okay. Well,
But I learned at a very young age that it doesn't matter how you feel, it only matters what other people think you feel. And if other people think you're happy, then you're happy. It doesn't matter.
oh, really?
I
It's a
don't actually believe
perception of
that, by
self.
the way. What?
Perception of self.
Perception of
Perception.
self is everything. That's very true, right? You're
Mhm.
not capable of unconditional love unless you unconditionally love yourself.
Yes.
And that's why so many people are incapable of it, because they don't love themselves. And with
Yeah.
a lot of people, I understand why.
You know, sometimes if you relive certain decades, you may end up liking that zone.
You asked me that question. If I could relive a decade, what would it be?
Which
And
one would
somebody,
it be? I want to know, like, which one
right. Well,
would
it
you
would be
love?
none, obviously, because I wouldn't be me anymore. But in a perfect world where there was no consequences, I would like to go and relive the 1970s in New York, and I would like to enjoy the New York that I was completely unaware of. The black part of New York, the Latino part of New York, the gay part of New York, the poor part of New York. People think of New York as this great cosmopolitan city, and it is, but it's also one of the most segregated cities on earth. I went to a documentary a couple of years ago with my son about the Apollo Theater, and I was shocked. I felt awful because whole new forms of music and culture and life were being created at the Apollo Theater, and I lived 40 blocks away, and I had absolutely no clue that any of it was going on. And so I would like to, and I have a very good friend, Charles Kaiser. He's a journalist, and we grew up in the same exact place in the same exact city. He's like 4 or 5 years older than I am. Our parents knew each other. They went to the same places, but his experience growing up in New York and my experience growing up in New York had nothing in common, because he was an out gay man,
Mm, mm.
and that changed everything for him.
Wow. Uh, I'm just being told my first client is about to come in 10
Okay,
minutes. However, I have like a gazillion other questions, and that has to be, I guess, episode 2.
okay. Can I just say, if anybody can still see,
Yes.
if you went back in time, would you have kids again? Hell
Yes.
yes.
How
Hell
did that
yes.
change? How did that change you?
It changed me in 1,000 measurable ways. It took me out of myself. It challenged me all the time. It made me feel younger again. It made me feel like life had some purpose other than becoming whatever it was that I had set as my final destination. It made me want to be. I mean, the desire to have children and the having of children made me want to be with a woman who did also change my life, who taught me about patience and who taught me about calmness. Well, she gets pretty crazy too, but and And my kids now, they help me. When I'm sad, they comfort me, and they still laugh at my jokes.
Listen, we all laugh at your jokes, and
Mostly.
I am I'm gonna we'll loop back from some of these questions because there are some of the articles that I want to find out a little more
Sure.
about what brought you to these. And I would like to, when David is doing his urgent issues thing, we can insert one of the episodes over there if you are available on Friday. But
Sure. Not this Friday, but yeah.
morning or evening,
Yeah.
afternoon. But the thing is that the next batch of questions will be, I'll just send you a little thing, but we have to still go over a bunch of the ones that you have
We didn't
already
get
asked.
to half of them. I've got great answers for some of
I
them.
know, exactly. I was like just trying to save them for the last, but we just went over. So take
All right.
care, Andy. I will see you, and I will see you again. And we will be circulating this for now. I
Great.
am so grateful that you're taking
I
time out.
really had fun.
Yes, absolutely. We haven't started. We're just getting started. All
Right.
right. Thank you.
All right.
Mwah. Bye.
Bye.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye.